So this project, Ghosts in Sunlight, it starts in two really separate moments, almost 20 years apart, and it's really linked up with my personal history, so I do have to start there as an intro to explaining the work. So I've been preoccupied with ideas of othering and belonging and how race, ethnicity, and class create identities for as long as I can remember. Those are really the themes of my childhood. So I was born in Greece, and my family and I immigrated to New York in 1980. We were poor and homeless, and we were really fortunate enough to be placed in public housing in Queens. And just for context, Queens has 2.3 million people and 138 languages are spoken. So it's a radically diverse place to be from. But I'm from a pocket of Queens called Astoria, and Astoria can formally be called a ghetto. Because Ghosts in Sunlight is very much about the accuracy of the words we use, and also about how language can be used as a political tool. So we can start with the working definition of the ghetto. And I use philosopher Tommy Shelby's definition of the ghetto, which is an area of concentrated, unjust disadvantage. So not just concentrated disadvantage, but there's something about it that's unjust. And this really aptly describes the 3-mile stretch that is my neighborhood. It's 3 miles of essentially public housing. It begins with Marine Terrace, and there's Ravenswood, and Victoria houses, and it culminates at Queensbridge. Queensbridge houses, you might have heard of it. One of the most famous public housing developments in the United States. Is the home of Nas, Mobb Deep, Roxanne Shante, and many other hip-hop radicals. And so, sandwiched between these 3 miles, are sandwiched between Rikers Island Correctional Facility on one end, and the bridge that takes one out of Queens into Manhattan proper on the other. And looking around the space, you might have noticed I used images of that particular bridge in a number of pieces. In one particular piece called The Distance or Chasm, I borrowed Tennessee Coates' words from his book Between the World and Me, and it says, "This chasm makes itself known to us in all sorts of ways." And that chasm is the distance, both emotional and physical, between the ghetto communities that I'm going to be talking about and their more affluent counterparts over that bridge. So I started making photographs. As a teenager, I received a gift from my brother. It was a camera. And at that time, I was really interested in counterculture, but what I was mostly doing was tagging up on like every possible wall in my neighborhood. So I was interested in graffiti. But what the camera allowed me to do was to start actually making images. So being behind that camera and looking, it gave me a space to be in the realm of ideas and in the realm of image making. And so Ghosts in Sunlight starts with some of those images dating from 1993. And there are these images here. So I started photographing, marginalized people. So I was photographing alternative youth culture, skaters, punks, the drag community downtown. And then I started to photograph myself and the buildings. So that's what I was finding interesting. And so some of these images here, the images with the smokestacks and the factory, were just across these photographs are taken out of my bedroom window. So it's right across from the housing project is this power plant. And it turns out that almost all of the themes that I would work on and work out in my practice, in my artistic practice, were already in those first images. And so those themes are the home, surveillance, privacy, my understanding of myself and my world and my community came through my interactions with power and how power was organized and enforced in my community. So those first information about power was my mother's interaction with labor. So you'll see a lot of these, the denim pieces and the sheet panels, or a portion of them, are about how, especially women in economically vulnerable communities, sell their labor for what accounts to lower than a living wage. So the problem of our poverty wasn't about work or lack of work or lack of hard work. Most of the women I know were certainly working 40 or more hours a week, but their labor never amounted to a living wage. And the reason why denim appears in my work particularly is because my mother was a garment worker doing piecework. Piecework is unregulated work, so it's neither unionized, and there isn't a lot of transparency about what a woman is going to be paid for her labor. So especially in this sheet panel about payday, it's a lot about that feeling of one having to fight for every penny. That's also trying to make $1.15 is something that's often said in the hood, but it's quite literal. Women were trying to piece together 15 cents a stitch or 5 cents a stitch so that a dress could be paid $2 per dress if you were lucky. So the second bit of information that I was gathering through my interactions with power was through my interactions with public assistance. So whether they were food stamp interviews or Medicaid interviews, a family has to apply and show up and basically be questioned and grilled. So those questions feel and are so violating to one's privacy because really nothing is off the table. It's not only your economics that are in question, but it's also your behavior. So, and this is especially true for mothers and for single women. So, who are your sexual partners? Do you have a boyfriend? Does he spend time in your home? Does he give you money? There's really no question that's outside of the scope of what's permitted in those interviews. And so that feels deeply, to me, and to the friends I know, deeply humiliating. And humiliating not because of our need. The need is not what's humiliating. What's humiliating are these paternalistic assumptions about our behavior, the questioning, and the idea that an accusation sort of follows you. There's an accusation there just by virtue of being poor. In fact, all of the sheet panels end with the word humiliated. Another bit of information through interactions with power informing identity are the rules and the aesthetics of ghettos or public housing. We'll look at that more specifically in specific works, but one thing that most people don't know about public housing is that it comes with home visits. Visits that are essentially inspections. In fact, the immigrants or Latinx women in the neighborhood, had no idea what inspection means, but they would call these mostly men coming into our home inspectora. It's like a made-up word for these people that are going to sort of come in and judge your home. There was never anything written to us about what exactly are you looking for and what are we being judged by. But we knew that they were interested in whether there was any business going on in the home. So were women involved my worth and my identity from sources that are really have nothing to do with me as a person. And this is true not just for me, but for communities like mine. And so for my community, many people feel an antagonistic relationship with the state. And that's because their homes and their family life are the locus of surveillance and for scrutiny. And these are communities that endure intrusions into their most private spaces. And so in some of the work, you might have noticed one of the fabric pieces in the end is entitled Unspoken Bargain. And another piece on this wall here says, you pay for it for sure. That's the opening line of an Amiri Baraka poem. So you pay for it for sure. While many of these people couldn't survive without public assistance, there's certainly a barter of your privacy. So the power plants imagery that shows up in the work emerged for me at some point as like the stand-in for state power in my life. I was like, you can't make this up. You can't make it up. There's a power plant outside your window. In one of the photographs, the text photos on the left side of the wall is entitled Exaggeration. The words that are tagged up on that picture are words like inspected, regulated, exposed, degraded, punished, deprived, surrounded, monitored. Those sound like really exaggerated words of one's experience, but they're not exaggerations at all. They're actually very, very accurate. So I want to emphasize one thing. The project that I've undertaken here is not, the issue I take up isn't with public housing. There's immense need for public housing, for affordable housing, for subsidized housing. The issue I take up is what happens to spaces once they're racialized. How does power begin to emerge when it's enforced on and against marginalized communities? So, in addition to having to reckon with sort of all the things that I just described, I also had to reckon with this dominant narrative beyond my neighborhood, mostly coming from a privileged sort of American chorus, that would cast my family's need as dependent, as somehow a failure, and as somehow un-American, so that our personal plight of poverty or suffering, I started to hear it being referenced as a morality issue and as a social burden. So one of the pieces that are on that monolith right behind you is entitled Poor Discipline. And that's one aspect of the dominant narrative. So we cast entire sections of urban and working poor, Black, brown, and immigrant communities as the antithesis of the American tradition of hard work and independence. And that really allows for deeply racist public policies and perceptions about the poor. And that outside narrative really completed the project of othering me. That was the last bit of information that I needed to know to really create that chasm. And so a fine point of this narrative is that it's the individual's responsibility. The individual has somehow failed. So it's an individual rather than a structural explanation of poverty. So there's the tension of the invisibility of people that are burdened with disadvantages of race or class. And then the market neoliberal focus on individual responsibility and the implied failure, your implied failure. And this is the tension, one of the tensions of the missing bodies in the photographs. It's why I photograph the buildings and the structures and what I see as the visual mechanisms of marginalization rather than photographing my homies. The project goes to some way, it ended up telling a structural story through a personal lens. So in other words, it's a public narrative about the social justice issues in areas of concentrated unjust disadvantage, simply embodied in the singular. So as I was putting this work together and going deeper and deeper into these issues, both personal, very personal and structural, I realized that I wasn't only interested in using a personal narrative to dismantle systems of injustice. I wanted to work to create a new and more accurate narrative about the poor and about the centrality of systemic racism in the politics of poverty. Because essentially there's nothing that remarkable about my story other than I'm telling it and I'm connecting my own dots and I get to be the arbiter of it. So I surely won't let someone else say it and use words like I was resorting to public assistance or we were accepting handouts. That's the sort of harmful language and the free market ideologies that would see my family's long-term relationship with public assistance as persistent or dependent, rather than rigged, rather than a systemic. And these are the moral constructs about poverty that we can call received ideas. Received ideas. James Baldwin calls the unaware adoption of received ideas as a labyrinth of attitudes, like a labyrinth of attitudes so deep and convoluted that they stand between ourselves and reality. And these are attitudes that he describes as historical and public, so that they have little to do with us as individuals, with our lived experience, or with reality. They're received ideas about how to perceive the world. So how do we begin to disengage from received ideas? One way is by doing what we're doing here today, is using public spaces, institutional spaces, educational spaces, to think critically, to observe, to be in dialogue. Another way is to use the cultural terrain. So artwork, clothing, and it's, fight poverty, not the poor. And that's the idea of switching the paradigm. And another way, a way that we can all do at all moments is to begin to connect one's personal history to larger histories, regardless of where you're from and what your experience is. And so we're each transmitting legacy, and to start to cultivate that capacity to see the cultural and economic forces that shape us and our identities. And to sharpen that awareness is to start to see the power structures at play. Because in a sense, we're all always translating. That's another phrase by Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're all always translating regardless of our background. So Coates is translating what it means to be Black in America, and I'm translating what it means to be a poor immigrant, and you all are translating all of your personal references. So trying to make meaning and sense and trying to understand what all these glaring lights and the cameras and the regulatory notices and, the state interviews and what all of that was telling me about myself has been a large impetus for this work. And the photos want to consider, the ramifications on communities that see themselves and their homes surrounded by the aesthetics of containment. So the fences, the barbed wire, and the aesthetics of surveillance. So in many of the text photos on this wall, you'll see glaring lights that are like interrogation lights right on our homes. Wires, cameras. What are the ramifications on communities that see their homes with the aesthetics of containment and the aesthetics of surveillance? Because ghettos are characterized by occlusion, right? By occlusion from participation and from opportunity, so from food, from transportation, from green spaces, from farmers markets, from jobs. But there's also occlusion from a welcoming sense of home, one that's not institutionalized. In the photos, in the text photos on the side of the wall, you'll see a lot of prohibitory signs. It's in this photo, text photo, it's here, it's there. These, I go out at night and I rip them down, but this is the actual sign on the buildings. So even to children, hey, no skateboarding, bicycle riding, rollerblading, no scooter riding. So not only are there not green spaces, but the concrete spaces we have, so the sidewalks, those are not played on. So this is what we associate, these kinds of prohibitory signs. It's what we associate with populations that are institutionalized. These are people to be controlled. This is what we do to people that we consider as dangerous or as threatening or as essentially less human and different than ourselves. So the ghetto, in fact, tells us a lot about ourselves. Not just me as a person living there, but gives us a lot of information just as citizens. And that is that ghettos are organized and sustained around a set of attitudes that legitimate dominance and subjugation. And that ghettos are perpetuated by the systemic racism and class subordination that upholds them. Cultural critic Henry Giroux says that the ghetto might be called a public spectacle of domination and subordination. It's treating everyday people that happen to be poor in an institutionalized manner. This is the power dynamic underlying the entire arrangement. And it's actually never hidden from view. It's hidden from our dialogue. And it's hidden because of what Audre Lorde calls a lack of disciplined attention. So observing with disciplined attention to your surroundings and to what they're telling you. And so the photographs, and especially the photographs in the work, are resistant insofar as they frame what photography allows us to see. They frame these visual mechanisms of marginalization. So we can become aware of the exclusionary practices that are enacted and enforced through the aesthetics of the urban terrain. But we can also see these power dynamics in the suburban terrain or in public spaces, simply by looking deeply and looking critically. And as we sharpen our skills of attention, we begin to recognize the central role of visual culture. So architecture, design, urban planning, all belonging in the realm of aesthetics. So how visual culture does the work of systemic racism and of classism. organizing these homes in the home life of the urban poor. It's vital to us if we are to understand one another, poor or not. White supremacy is deeply implicated in the existence of ghettos. The economic segregation of the ghetto is a direct consequence of the racist legacies of our country. And it can't really be understood at all apart from systemic racism. And so another part of this work for me, especially considering my mother's labor, the labor that goes on in communities such as mine, and the underground economies in communities such as mine, what are called criminal activities. And one way to understand the underground economy and economies of labor that's essentially stolen or underpaid is linking white supremacy to the economic system that upholds it. So white supremacy does have an economic ideology that is its counterpart, and that's an economy of extraction. And once that was stolen labor, and now it's exploitative labor, but this is racial capitalism. Naomi Klein asks us to, quote, see the utility of racism in the capacity to write off entire populations as other, and as integral to the proliferation and maintenance of an economy designed to fortify the wealth and power of the few. So, in addition to the work being done by the Black-led multiracial uprisings of today, we also have to consider that there's no racial justice without economic justice, that has to be part of it. So the connection between economic and racial justice isn't a new idea by any means. It's just an unresolved idea. It was one of the major tenets of Martin Luther King's 1968 For the People's Campaign. It was maybe number 1 or 2 in the Black Panther Party's 10-point plan, and it was central to the Black radical movement. And this is why fusion movements today are so important, or why integrative studies is so important. Because in the tradition of Angela Davis today, we've spoken about the intersections of class, of race, of gender, labor, immigration. And those are all signposts of oppression, and how oppressions are linked, and it's only by making those connections and honing our skills really to recognize those deep connections that we can become or begin to get out of them. So we can, do you want to stop for a moment? And are there any questions that you might have up until this moment? Is it good? Okay. So, I want to consider a little bit how injustices persist and introduce a concept called cultural denial. So the sociologist Stanley Cohen teaches us about cultural denial, and that means how do we come not to see injustice? How do we know what not to know? Okay? Because there are facts. There are 140 million Americans living in poverty. In Ohio alone has about 1.6 million people. More than half of American children are being parented in poor, low-income homes. So these are facts. John Powell was a man that lived and worked in Ohio for many years, understands this kind of inequality as an expulsion. So who is in the circle of human concern and who's properly out of it? So in the dominant narrative, instead of asserting the injustice of limited life trajectories available to the poor or their opportunities, we adopt punitive language to describe them. And so the rhetoric of individual responsibility and the moral lapses of poor, denies that there's formal economic segregation. We deny the institutional and cultural postures that tell people, poor and working class people, that their lives and their labor, simply put, are worth less. And that neoliberal ideology just denies that there are any power structures that shape people's lives. So I'm going to pause here and pivot and talk a little bit about hip-hop and urban art. That's also part of this project. When I was putting together what I thought were just like my intuitions about my past, it became linked with all this research, became linked with the work of mostly Black thinkers that were framing the essential parallels between the politics of poverty and institutional racism. And just like you guys keep in line with them. So just like when my people let me know, this is my reading of my research and my pictures or whatever, my note taking. So that's been a big part of this project. Another really huge part of this project is thinking about hip-hop and the importance of hip-hop. Because we can situate ourselves really not only with sort of the academics that have taken on the task of cultural critique, but also the American artists and thinkers and hip-hop radicals that have done the same. So right outside the gallery space is a videotape DJ set by DJ Quintega. He's from Columbus. He's amazing and talented, and you can listen to it on your way out a little bit, but you can also listen to it online. The whole set is up on the Otterbein art website. So it was a way to, having the music sort of stream into the space has been a way to recognize hip-hop as a global cultural movement that was created in the spaces that we've been talking about today. And I want to say that the ghetto poor are definitely, certainly not a cohesive cultural group, nor do they share a common culture, because one of the convenient myths and narratives is that somehow the ghetto poor share a culture of poverty. There's no such thing. There is no such thing. What they do share, though, is they can feel responsible and part of a distinct cultural movement, which is hip-hop, that was born out of the concerns of poor urbanites. And counterculture has always been a way for marginalized people to have a voice and express themselves without any sort of permission. And growing up, there were so few spaces to talk about poverty, but hip-hop does all the time. So I've been really interested in how marginalized people take their other and turn it into art or craft or voice. So for me personally, the profound connection between visual culture and poverty, that art could say those unsayable things, those things that there were never spaces to say, and that's been the realm of hip-hop and of graffiti. So outsider groups that come together to invent these self-determined worlds in which they can exist together sort of with their own ethics and their own aesthetics and their own fashion. They're creating spaces of defiance and spaces of dissent and spaces free of state power. So one of the last images in the gallery is of a bridge. It's next to the two fabric portraits. And that is entitled Desire and Delight. It's an image of the bridge seen from the roof of the project. And the text says, "It was always more important what others said about us, not what we said about ourselves. But on the roof, it was our desire and delight." So hip-hop does a lot of that Carnegie and does a lot of that as sort of a global cultural movement of revolution. It's creating spaces free of state power, spaces where you can self-define yourself. And there's a lot of hip-hop sensibility in the work itself. The text photos are tagged in white Sharpie. And sometimes they're tagged so repeatedly, like in the block, and in Desire and Delight. It's really reminiscent of city walls where the tags, which are people's surrogates, it's you in tag form, where those tags are starting to be layered one on top of the other, everyone's presence one on top of the other, until it turns into abstraction. And that happens in some of my favorite actually text photos. So it's a way to inscribe your dissent, it's a way to inscribe your presence, but it's also a way to create community. So on your way out, if you felt drawn to it, there's a responsible where you can tag up. And so while voices from the hood and hip hop have obviously affected global culture, there hasn't been that qualitative leap in our sensibilities toward the marginalized. So we consume hip-hop, we consume hip-hop culture, we consume the linguistics, we consume the fashion without sort of linking it to its deep, deep histories. And that's what's formally called cultural appropriation. So it's just an invitation really to just become sensitized to that. Because everything I've talked about today is a contested history and a contested narrative, and hip-hop belongs in that contested narrative. So we have to be careful about the way culture is erased or obscured or placed in a hierarchy of work. I'll read you a great quote by Robin D.G. Kelly. The importance of the cultural terrain as a site of struggle, which shapes ideology, public policy, scholarship, and social movements. It's crucial to ask how what is normalized within visual culture impacts our ability to critique or think critically about dominant narratives. And so if you're interested in going deeper in any of the themes that we've talked about today, Professor Hayes and Professor Kohler can give you a copy of a bibliography with further reading sources. We can pause here and take some questions, specifically about the work, how it's made, or about anything that we've spoken about today.
Well, thank you so much. Please just